He's only bringing them together for the purposes of accomplishing this finite objective. Okay. Okay, Project Management Institute. Well, Project Management Institute does a number of things. One of the things it does is provide, in essence, a code of ethics for the discipline. It also provides education, and I know some of you have, oh, Kofi, how are you?
Oh, good.
Come on up here, I've got a study guide for you.
I saw him driving around looking for a parking
I
spot
know,
too.
it's terrible today.
That more than 10 minutes outside.
I know, it's awful. I had the same problem today. It's the worst I've ever seen it, so. We'll get you caught up here. Basically, what we've said is that there'll be 20 short answers on the exam, 2 to 3 sentences. So each of these topics we're talking about, I'll give you some highlights, but I'm recommending that you go back to the textbook and review the section that applies to each of these areas. So we're just at the point now we're talking about Project Management Institute, and what I said is that one of their prime reasons for existing is to provide this code of ethics for the industry. But secondfold, they provide that certification. And I know a number of you are interested in the certification. So certifications in general give some credibility to any discipline and to the individuals that are involved in particular. And that's one area that I'm glad we had Sherry Gowdy come in and speak to, because I think she put into perspective pretty well the fact that yes, it does give you some credibility and some background, but she also was realistic in saying, but don't do it, after you've done too many projects in the real world, because they're looking for a particular set of answers. But that's the role that they play. So what's an overdetermined project?
It's an imposed project. That is a project that is, the budget is.
It's imposed.
Yeah.
Any one of them. It says that if the budget, schedule, and scope are completely inflexible, it's overdetermined. Because for the project manager to be successful requires that they have some flexibility. And if there is no chance of flexibility, unfortunately, you're destined for failure. Because as you saw in the Big Dig, even where there was good planning, there are unanticipated events.
Will you please say again? Overdetermined projects.
It's where all 3 of the components of it, meaning budget, schedule, and scope, are fixed, so there is no flexibility. Because we know that if you can move any of the other 2, you can work with it. One of the project manager's main jobs is to manage the trade-offs between those. Like if you're responsible for the building next door and I come to you next week and I say, the parking lot has to be finished this spring, we cannot wait till fall because students can't get to class. Then you say, absolutely, I can finish it next week, but it's gonna require more resources. So I'm gonna need more money so I can pay my people overtime. So we are able to impact schedule, we'll keep the scope the same by adding more money. In other situations where people wanna change the scope, perhaps they wanna add additional features to something, we say, yeah, we could do that, and we might have to both extend the schedule and offer more money. So an overdetermined project is one where you have no flexibility. As long as you have some flexibility, the project manager's job is to always be managing those trade-offs.
One
Yeah.
question before, maybe I'm late. The project goals, are you choosing the 3 project goal or you want the 4 project goals?
the triangle of budget,
Yeah.
schedule, and scope.
Yeah, but in another part of the book, of the textbook, they add uncertainty. as a
Uncertain risk.
critical-
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen that, but they do, and it's important to talk about risk, but everywhere else you look, including in the PennBook, they're gonna talk about the
Those
three
two,
primary
yeah.
ones.
I just
yeah.
want to.
I appreciate what you're saying, because I did make note of that as well. It's really important, because we saw what impact risk had on the project at the Big Dig.
Yes.
The one that's got
Because
me
I don't
nervous
want
about
to
even
maybe-
driving through the
Yeah,
city, right?
I don't want to maybe not cite it and it is.
Yeah. No, I understand. Okay. Let's see. Oh, project selection criteria. There, what I'd like you to do is take a look at, there are things like the weighted scoring model and net present value in the textbook. We didn't spend a lot of time talking about those, but understand that, in some situations, you want to have qualitative measures considered as well as quantitative. So that would be one advantage to using, for example, a weighted scoring method over a pure net present value. And an example of that might be safety. Maybe safety is something that you can't put a hard dollar, it won't drive revenue for the organization, but it's really important for ensuring that your people have a good, secure working environment. So go back and, like I said, and review different selection criteria from that perspective. But then also, I think it's important to note that when you're selecting which projects to work on, and you'll recall, we kind of did that way back in our first exercise, talked about which projects might be important, like we eliminate the one that looks like it's fluff and just a pipe dream of the CEO. But understand that no matter what method you use to select projects, sometimes you have to do it, whether there's a payback or not. And we call those mandated projects. And I'll give you an example of a mandated project. Suppose the IRS comes along and they change tax structure for your employees. There's no cost payback to doing that. There's no added value to your customer for doing that. No added value to your employees for doing it. But it's mandated. You do it because you have to. So while the selection criteria are important, we still understand that sometimes we do things because we have to. Sarbanes-Oxley, for example, are you familiar with that? Is a bill that was passed by Congress that had to do with,
Someone is Oxley.
yes, you know, same thing. Or those Y2K projects I talked about way back on our first class meeting. You know, most people viewed those as a necessary expense because they thought the uncertainty of potentially their systems blowing up, even though there wasn't a direct revenue driver to the organization for doing that, the risk of not outweigh the benefit. So net present value, understanding discounted cash flows, these things are all important, but the reason we didn't spend too much time on them in the class is because the weighted scoring methods usually went out so that you can, in fact, apply a value to the non-monetary items that are important to your business, and because some projects are in fact mandated. Anybody have anything to add to that? Right, define program. You understand the difference between a program and a project.
Yes.
What's the difference?
A program is a kind of a bigger project that we have in different sections.
Or a program could have multiple projects
Yes.
underneath it. It's
Correct.
the overall entity that relies on the completion of separate individual projects, related projects.
Okay, this is the first example. I just want to be very clear. I don't know how you want us to define, maybe when you say define the program, maybe I can say that it's a large integrated, I can give a short.
I don't remember exactly how the questions worded, Kofi. I think it's something like contrast the difference between a project and a program. And that's why I'm saying what I'd like, and I don't know that that's literally it, but it's something along those lines. So the gist of what I'd like you to know is that program might be made up of multiple related projects that get managed to meet an overall strategic goal or objective of your organization. And the project portfolio process, you know, your selection of projects is part of the program. Okay?
Okay, because maybe I might say that it's a large integrated project. So, I just wanted to ask if you want short answers or you want us to develop the
2 to 3 sentences.
2 to 3, that's right.
2
Because
to 3
for
sentences.
instance,
Yeah, don't give, I'm not looking for anything more than 2 to 3 sentences.
uh,
Although, I know I don't need to say this in this class because you're all 400 level students, graduate students. But in some of the lower level classes, some students count one sentence as restating the question. Like if I said, contrast the difference between projects and programs, their first sentence would be, and now I'd like to contrast the difference between projects and programs. You'd be surprised how often. Okay. All right. Okay. Systems approach. In general, where I'm going with this is understand, this is where that idea of sub-optimization comes into play, is understand that we have to know the interrelationships and interdependencies between projects to understand how they work together and avoid sub-optimization. Now, someone define for me what sub-optimization is. What's sub-optimization? That's what we avoid. We said that's what we avoid by taking a systems approach. So what's sub-optimization? All right, I'll give you the example I use frequently. I have just hired Amanda to be my purchasing manager. And I'm really looking to save some money this year. So I told her, if you cut the budget by 10%, I'm gonna give you $1,000 at the end of the year. And if you cut the budget by 20%, you're gonna get $5,000 at the end of the year. So what's Amanda gonna do?
Buy low cost, low quality
Yeah,
parts.
and then they're gonna show up and they are gonna work, right? That's sub-optimization, when you take one piece, one project, and you optimize it, but but at the expense of the entire organization. I worked for an entity once that had the world's most aggressive accounts receivable person. And the boss was always patting her on the back and said he'd never seen anybody better at collecting money. I was in sales at the time, and I knew she was majorly hacking off and offending every customer I had. To the point that some of them literally didn't want to do business with us anymore. So was the fact that she was good at collecting money good for the organization? If we were losing customers because of it? No, that's sub-optimization. So taking a systems approach ensures that each project and each piece is understood within the realm of how it works for the total organization.
Can our short answers be examples, or do you want?
Yeah.
Okay. Your examples?
Yeah, I don't care.
Okay.
Sure.
For the simple optimization, I put up a definition there. That is when team members focus on their individual tasks and subtasks, it gives rise to suboptimal.
That's what I'm saying. When one group or one entity is so focused on their piece of what's going on that they fail to recognize how it affects the entire organization. And the two examples were Amanda, who is so good at saving us money, but she was delivering terrible products. She saved us money, but she bought some quality, so the organization suffered. Or my real world example, my accounts receivable person who was really good at collecting money, but she hacked off every customer I had, and actually led to a decrease in future business. So those are both examples of situations where someone's really, really good at their individual piece of it, but they fail to consider how it impacts the entire organization. When we talk about sub-optimization and TQM, I think the exact quote from the book is, the operation was a success, but the patient died. Meaning that everybody individually did everything according to textbook, but they failed to consider how their actions affected the overall. Does that make sense? Okay. So Project Titus, you know what that is? Basically, back to the role of the project manager, the textbook clearly states that one of the most important qualities you look for in a project management is someone who's a closer. Someone who's able to stop, see the scope of the project, put it into it, then we learn from it and move on. Project Titus happens when we all like each other so much that at the end of this semester we say, we don't want to end this, we want to go have project management too. And you guys end up, Rod's going, boy, that's a factory. So you guys never end up getting grades, the organization can't say we've completed it, but it's any time that team members just get along so well that they almost end up being more loyal to the project than they are to their individual departments and multidisciplinary teams. So that's why over and over again, the textbook in different ways says it's really important. There are times when you extend the scope after a project started, but typically the goal is to complete the the initial scope that we very clearly defined up front in that project launch meeting, end that project, and then if warranted, start a second one, as opposed to constantly extending it. And a really similar concept is that of scope creep. So what is scope creep?
Adding more scope to the project scope.
Yeah, I'm building a house for you, and you come to me and you say, you know what, Joe and I decided we'd really like to have a bathroom in the basement. And then you come to me next week and say, oh, we just got a puppy, I want a fence in the backyard. And all these things individually don't sound like that big a deal, but by the time you've added 10, 12, 15 of those items, suddenly there is no end to your project. And, or you risk the client becoming really unhappy because they get to the end of the day and Kofi no longer remembers that we agreed on $200,000 to complete his house. And now that it's $250,000 because I've added that bathroom and the fence and all these other things, you've kind of forgotten along the way because individually they seem like pretty small things. So we want to avoid scope creep, primarily because it leads to unsatisfied customers. Even though you think initially you're doing what they're asking you to do. And that's why we use really well-defined change notice process where we do, like when I was building my house and we did make a few changes every time, no matter how small it was, the builder would come to us and make us sign a piece of paper saying we understood. We understood what was going to happen to either the time frame or the cost of the project. Because he didn't want us to come to the end and be dissatisfied because that's when we suddenly realized that it was 40% more than we originally agreed to. So, where possible, you complete a project as it is and then start a second one. Maybe I could say, Kofi, I understand completely what you're saying. Let's finish the house and then we'll start a second project to do the basement, bathroom, and the fence. Sometimes if they're small enough or important enough, we go ahead and change the scope. But usually, the recommendation is not to do that. Virtual projects. You guys know what virtual projects are, right? What's a virtual project?
It's where the project team is all over the other countries and speak other languages.
Yeah. That's the most challenging case. I work on virtual projects with Macomb. We do have some cultural differences between us and Macomb, but that's a whole different subject. But not in the sense of we do on a global basis, but it just is more practical than getting in the car to meet with them face to face. It's using the power of technology, which we couldn't have done this 20 years ago or 30 years ago. It's harnessing the power of technology to work with project teams that have the greatest level of expertise. If the best expert engineering expertise for a particular project happens to be in Oregon, then let's Skype them into meetings and let them be where they are. Or if they happen to be in Ghana, let's make sure that we have made an accommodation to include them on the team. So yes, cultural differences can be an important variable, but there are huge advantages in being able to harness the expertise of individuals that might have specific or unique talents. And it's only possible through our use of technology. But it's also made open up our marketplaces. And they truly are global today in a way that they weren't 20 years ago. you heard Sherry talk quite a bit about the influence of global marketplaces. I went home and asked my husband if it was true that they actually got all the way to Brazil before they realized the cell phone technology down there wouldn't capture that data every 30 minutes, like she said. I mean, it seems improbable that people that bright in a company that large could have something like that happen, but I'm sure it was true. It's so easy to overlook the details that we wouldn't on the surface consider. Wouldn't even think to consider that if you didn't have the right parties involved that could say, I'm not so sure we could do that. So, a project plan. Project plan. What's the importance of the project plan? It's probably the most important place you can spend time. Let me see what else specifically. Oh. I think there, we had talked early on about how many organizations are using project plans for even more frequent or routine types of activities, and that the advantage of that is mainly because you have a template. You have a starting place for understanding, just like when we talked about scheduling in OM, we said you were at a big disadvantage if you didn't have any historic knowledge to start from. The use of a project plan enables this template for use in future projects, as well as helps you avoid some of, or mitigate, if you can, some of the risk involved by making sure that you've taken under consideration as much of the known risk as you can.
I didn't get it. Would you please say again? The main points.
All right, the main points of a project plan is, first of all, to spend more time in planning than you think you need to, because it's only then that you'll uncover some of the potential unknowns. But we use it to hopefully mitigate risk by trying to understand all the potential risks. But that using a project plan has the added value of, at the end of the day, creating a template that could be potentially used going forward in managing future projects. Those are the key points there, I think. Okay, what's a work breakdown structure? You did one. What's a work breakdown structure?
Assigns task in the order which to be completed.
It's input to the schedule, not necessarily initially in order, but sometimes it is because you're identifying tasks and subtasks for the purpose of understanding precedent relationships. Absolutely. Usually you break it down into the lowest level of task reasonable. Could be a few hours of duration, a few days of duration, depending on the magnitude of your product or your project. But you want to have the parent, and then break it down into tasks and subtasks as reasonable to understand predecessors and their importance. this RACI matrix, RACI, that's responsible, accountable, consulting, informed, yeah. And sometimes it's a chart with symbols or pictures, sometimes they just use the letters. But the overwhelming benefit to that is making sure that all parties are informed. I think that the example they used in the textbook was, you know, a large multidisciplinary project, a manager had said, yes, you can have these 2 key resources you need, and I will save them for you for the week of March 1st. They're really important to me, but I'm gonna save them for your project. Well then, about this time, the project gets behind schedule and somebody forgets to tell that manager. So he's dedicated these really valuable resources and now they don't need him for another 2 weeks. So it's understanding that that role of informing people is just as important as understanding who's accountable for a task. And have you ever been in a situation where you're not sure whether you're the responsible person or not? It's easy to happen in meetings. If you don't say specifically who's gonna complete this task, everybody goes away with the idea that we're all working on it, or who's working on it. So a very useful tool, a practical tool. Project Council, their main objective is to establish a strategic direction for the project. The project portfolio process is the one that says we want to make sure that these projects adhere to the goals and strategy of the organization.
The main objective again.
The main objective is to establish a strategic direction for the project. They might also be responsible for allocating resources, if they're company-wide resources. You know, I think Sherry talked about the fact that at DEER they have a larger project, a PMO, project management organization, that has some resources available to projects in terms of education and individuals that have certain amounts of training, for example. So it's to make sure that you're consistent with the strategic vision, direction of the organization, and at the same time might be responsible for the allocation of some resources. Okay, the project launch meeting. What's the main objective of the project launch meeting? I was really interested to hear Sherry say that this is really important on the projects, because sometimes you read this stuff and it's kind of like in Bach where she went, well, you know, some of it's not real. It was interesting to me that she saw that as clearly being really important. And for what reasons? Do you remember why she said that project launch meeting was so important?
Make sure that all functional managers do understand the projects.
Yeah, it's important, especially if these functional managers are the ones that are gonna be allocating resources to the project, that they understand how important it is. But I think it's equally important if you're one of the workers on the project, that you see your boss in the room hearing that, and you hear them also acknowledging it's important, so that you know that it's vitally important to the organization. Because Because if a manager doesn't go, he gives the impression to the employees it's not that important. It's not that important for the organization for me to be there. So do you invite the people that are actually doing the work? There's some pros and cons to that. I'd say yes, in essence. You know, the danger in that is at the time you do the project launch meeting, you might not have identified all the resources you need yet. So you potentially don't have everyone at the table. But if there are people that you know are gonna be strategically important to the project, and they are clearly identified, then it would make sense to have them there. Once again, so that you're validating the importance of the project, and so that everyone understands exactly what's to be accomplished and how it fits within the bigger picture of the organization. Project charter. What you have, when you have, a project charter is a project plan that all of the stakeholders have signed off on. So if it's an external to the company, then that might include the people working on it, managers involved, as well as the client. But the project charter is the document that exists when the project planning is completed. And the people have actually signed off on it. So what's it gonna include? It's gonna include those elements like what is the scope, what is the budget, what is the risk, what is the schedule, you know, all of the deliverables up to and including how we will evaluate success will all be included in that project charter. So it's a fairly detailed document that comes about as a result of completing the project planning and having all of the stakeholders sign off on it. Risk management, we talked about risk a little bit, especially with the viewing of the Big Dig and the magnitude of potential disaster, loss of lives, if that was failed. But usually when we approach risk, we're looking at two things. We're looking at the likelihood and the severity of any given risk. We look at both the likelihood and the severity. Because if a risk is not likely, but the consequences are very severe, then we probably do want to engage in a fair amount of planning for a contingency. But if the likelihood and the severity are both low, we may say that's acceptable risk.
It is what?
If the likelihood of a risk or the severity are low, both likelihood and severity, then we may say that's acceptable. We understand that there's some risk of that happening, but it's an acceptable amount of risk.
How many people are you gonna kill?
Well, let's hope it's not quite that severe. Let's hope it's more like, you know, my example about my windshield fire. right. Eventually, those windshield wiper blades are gonna go back, cause I've been talking about for 2 years, I'm not Amanda.
Yes.
You're tired of hearing about it.
No, I love hearing about your windshield wipers.
But, cause
I'm
I've been telling this
impressed.
story since operations management about the guy that changed my oil, that told me it was time to change my windshield wiper blades, cause the owner's manual said they were rated to only last that long. And my response was, I also don't go around and change my light bulbs, and I know that I've used it for 1,000 hours, I wait for them to burn out, right? Because I know that's gonna happen eventually, but my perceived severity of that happening. Now, if I ever get into a car accident that's based on my windshield wipers not working, you guys are all have the right to come back and say, you were newly warned. But my perceived risk is that when they really get that bad, I'll have time to change that. It's not gonna happen while I'm driving down the road at 65 miles per hour. It'll probably happen gradually over time. So, that's severity and likelihood.
I have a spare one in my truck.
You do?
Yeah.
Well, this just goes to show that everybody views severity and likelihood differently, don't they? Now, where I want a lot of backup systems in place and contingency plans is when I go into the operating room or get on an airplane. Right? That's where I really don't want anybody taking any risk. Negotiation. We say, we said earlier the project manager should be a facilitator. We said that the project manager should be a closer. But just as important, that project manager's gotta be a negotiator, because he may be responsible, but he doesn't always control all the resources that he needs. So we also talked about the difference between win-win and win-lose negotiation. We gave examples. We said a win-lose negotiation is typically when you're buying a house or a car. Because if I get it at a better price, that means the salesperson that sold it to me took less of a commission. So one person wins to the other's detriment. What we seek in project management is that concept of the win-win, which means sometimes you have to look for a third alternative. And the example in the textbook was, we're doing some software development, and the engineer says we really need some additional function. And they said it's not practical, they went out and found a third way of accomplishing the very same objective. So sometimes to get a win-win, you have to look for a third, alternative. But understand that the role of negotiation is key. So the project manager is gonna be what? A negotiator, a closer, and a facilitator.
Please, sorry, the last sentence that you pronounced, can you repeat that?
What the project manager is?
Yeah.
I said he's a closer, meaning that he has the ability to not allow this to go free. To say, put a finite end to the project. We're gonna, he's a closer in that sense. He's a negotiator in that he looks for those win-win opportunities. And that lastly, he's a facilitator, meaning that he often does not have direct management authority over his project team members. So, he's pretty important. Do you feel pretty good about all this? You feel like we talked about, and I think we have talked about, most of these concepts over the last couple of weeks. When you come in here on Tuesday, I said you'll write 2 to 3 sentences, reflections on these topics. Some are written in the form of a question. Some will say define this, some will say contrast these two things. I mean, but they're not, nothing's meant to be tricky. My recommendation is look at your notes, go back to the textbook and review the sections that apply to each one of these topics. And like I said, we'll see you on Tuesday. You know,